Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Grace Holland. Hurricane Milton is expected to be one of the most destructive storms on record when it makes landfall along the Gulf Coast of Florida late Wednesday. It is not expected to hit our state, but as thousands of people evacuate, we are still feeling some of the effects. WRAL Meteorologist Aimee Wilmoth joins me to talk about the potentially record-breaking storm. Aimee, thank you for being here.
Sure, thanks for having me.
So what is it that makes Milton so potentially catastrophic?
So it really depends on the track of the center of circulation. And right now it looks like the center could go right over Tampa Bay. And what you have is you have a counterclockwise spin. So think about the southern part of the storm. That's where you're going to have the highest storm surge. And this is going to be a pretty large storm. Once it gets to Florida, it's likely going to make landfall as a Category 3. So that's major hurricane. That's going to drive in so much water on the south side of the center of circulation. The storm surge could be some of the worst storm surge that Tampa Bay has ever had. So we're talking about 10 to 15 feet. And that's why people are asked to evacuate. And it's totally flat there. So that amount of storm surge will go well inland as well. So it's not just right along the coast. This is going to go well inland if this actually happens, 10 to 15 foot storm surge. And not only that, but they have the highest risk for excessive rain. And, I don't like to compare storms, but for our mountains with Helene, they had the highest risk for rain. Mm-hmm. And we saw what happened in the mountains. So they're expected to have devastating flooding as well. So you have the storm surge, you have the devastating flooding. You're also going to have tornadoes. We always get those pretty much with big hurricanes, even small hurricanes. So the southern part of that, they're going to have tornadoes and they're going to have wind, obviously. They're going to have hurricane force winds along the west side of the coast and also even inland. And this is likely going to stay a hurricane all the way through its progression of moving through Florida. So the impacts are going to be really, really big. There's just no way around it.
Right. And so, you mentioned Tampa Bay. We're kind of still waiting to see what happens in the next few hours as it gets closer. Where sort of is the cone that we expect it to hit? And why isn't it like we know for sure where it's going to hit at this point?
It's still pretty far away at this point. I mean, it's not expected to make landfall until probably very, very early Thursday morning. Now, the cone, if you've been watching us, it has narrowed in its width. With each update we get, the cone continues to narrow. So as it gets closer, the models have a better idea of what the atmosphere is like. Also, now that it's getting so close, there are multiple flights a day of hurricane hunters gathering data. And all that data goes into models, and that makes the models predict even better what will likely happen. So as it gets closer, we start to really narrow down that cone, and we've really seen that narrowing. We'll continue to see it kind of narrow, but it is really looking like a Tampa Bay landfall, somewhere around Tampa Bay.
Okay. And is it unusual to have a storm develop the way that this one has?
Absolutely. So I was chatting with Mike Mays about this. I said, can you recall ever something developing in the southwestern Gulf of Mexico and taking this track, going to Florida? And he said, I really can't recall one. Now, that doesn't mean one doesn't exist. It's just neither of us can recall this ever happening. A lot of times when they form in the southwestern Gulf, what they'll do is they'll go into Mexico, they'll go into Texas, they'll go into Louisiana. It's very rare to see it take this track that it's taking.
Right. And I would think that means that it's over those warm Gulf of Mexico waters longer than if it were going to Texas, Louisiana, and all those places.
And those sea surface temperatures are way above normal. And that's just feeding this storm. And there's been very little wind shear. So the upper level winds with wind shear, they tend to tear apart storms. And there's been very little wind shear. So there's just been nothing really getting in its way from staying this strong major hurricane. And it looks like there's nothing that's going to get in its way, really.
Okay. Let's take a quick break right there and we'll be right back. Aimee, before the break, we were talking about the situation of this particular storm, and you kind of mentioned sort of looking back at previous storms, have we seen something like this? I wonder, has Florida seen a 1-2 punch like this before? I'm talking about, obviously it just had Helene hit that state 2 weeks ago, and now here we are. So has Florida dealt with something like that in recent memory?
I have not. In my memory, I can't recall something quite like this. So you not only have a 1-2 punch, but you have Helene, which was a Category 4 at landfall. That's major for them. And this could be a Category 3 major hurricane, maybe a Category 4. We'll have to wait and see. Hopefully it'll weaken to a Category 3. So we're talking about, in the span of a couple of weeks, 2 major hurricanes hitting the west coast of Florida. It is not usual, I can tell you that for sure. In the last 2 years, Florida has had 5 hurricane landfalls. This year they've had 3. They had Debbie, which was a Category 1, and then they had Helene, Category 4, and now we're talking about Milton, which is likely to be major when it makes landfall.
Right. And so with this storm, we're expecting will hit that part of Florida and then go across into the Atlantic. What do we think is going to happen with this storm from there?
So we've had several tropical systems in the Atlantic. And because of that, our sea surface temperatures are actually cooler than normal in the Atlantic right now. These storms cause upwelling, which drives in the cold waters at the bottom of the ocean. It drives them upwards. And so what it's going to do, it's going to weaken. All models indicate that it will weaken as it emerges back into the Atlantic, and that's because it doesn't have those super warm waters to feed off of like it does in the Gulf.
Okay, so good news there once the storm gets out into the Atlantic. How is the rest of hurricane season looking?
So I still think we have a ways to go. We still have 2 areas right now that are highlighted by the National Hurricane Center. Both have only a 20% chance of development, but that's just a sign that things haven't slowed down. There's still stuff out there that we have to monitor. So I think we have to get all the way through November before we really start to feel good about things. But it's definitely been a busy season, and it was forecast to be a pretty busy season. And in September and October have just been really, really hard.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Aimee. We appreciate the WRAL weather team for all the work that you guys are doing to follow this. And thank you for listening to the WRAL Daily Download. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.